You are going to sign this airworthiness certificate right now, or I will personally make sure the bank locks the doors on this place. By Friday, Julian was standing in the middle of Hangar 3, wearing a suit that cost more than Elias made in a month. He pushed the clipboard across the metal workbench. Elias Thorne didn't yell. He didn't beg for his job. He just wiped the grease off his hands with a blue shop towel, picked up the keys to the multi-million-dollar VIP helicopter, and tossed them into the trash can. He knew exactly what was at stake. He was a single dad, 3 months behind on his mortgage. And Julian was the operations director for AeroCorp. Julian had the power to crush him. But what Julian didn't understand was that Elias wasn't just being stubborn. He was trying to keep a dozen people from falling out of the sky at 3,000 feet. Within 24 hours, the billionaire owner of that helicopter would show up at the hangar. And when the company's chief pilot saw what Elias had done, he wouldn't fire the mechanic. He would refuse to fly the aircraft. If you believe that doing the right thing matters more than a paycheck, hit the subscribe button. We share stories about quiet professionals who hold their ground when the pressure is on. Now, let's get back to the hangar. Elias's shop sat on the far end of the county airfield. It always smelled like jet fuel, old coffee, and rain. It wasn't a fancy corporate operation, but every tool was in its exact place, and the floor was swept spotless. Elias was 42, tired, and running out of time. The final notice from the bank was sitting on his desk under a coffee mug. He had exactly 2 weeks to come up with $15,000, or they were going to foreclose on the shop. And if he lost the shop, the custody arrangement for his 8-year-old daughter, Lily, was going to be called into question. Lily was sitting on a stool in the corner that evening, using an old wrench to draw circles on a piece of scrap cardboard. She looked up at the massive machine taking up the center of the bay. "Dad, is the big helicopter sick?" she asked. Elias smiled, though his shoulders ached. "Yeah, Peanut. It's got a bad cough. Are you going to make it better?" "I'm going to try, but we have to do it the right way, not the fast way." Lily nodded, like she completely understood how the world worked. The helicopter was an Augusta Series executive transport. It was owned by AeroCorp, and it was supposed to be a routine 500-hour inspection. Julian had brought the contract to Elias 3 days ago. It paid exactly enough to clear the bank debt and keep the lights on for another 6 months. It felt like a lifeline. But Julian had made it clear that the timeline was non-negotiable. The chairman of the board was flying to a massive merger meeting on Friday morning. The bird had to be ready. Elias had agreed to the timeline because a visual inspection and routine fluid flush shouldn't take more than 3 days. But Elias never just looked at the surface. He worked the way he lived, carefully and quietly. On Thursday afternoon, he started checking the torque values on the main rotor hub. This was the critical assembly that kept the spinning blades attached to the rest of the helicopter. As he put his wrench on the third retaining bolt, he felt it. It wasn't a sound. It was a vibration through the steel. The metal felt slightly soft. Elias frowned, pulling out his flashlight and a magnifying glass. He wiped the factory grease away. A certified aerospace retaining bolt has a specific manufacturer's stamp embossed into the metal. It proves the titanium alloy has been X-rayed for microfractures. The bolt Elias was looking at was completely blank. He checked the next one. Blank. He stripped the housing back and checked the entire ring of 16 load-bearing bolts. None of them had stamps. They were counterfeit parts. They looked identical to the real thing, but they were probably made of cheap, low-grade steel. If you put 1,000 horsepower of torque on those bolts, they wouldn't hold. They would shear right off, and the main rotor would separate from the aircraft in mid-air. Elias checked the maintenance logs. The last time this hub was serviced, it was signed off by an internal AeroCorp team, overseen by Julian. Elias didn't wait. He walked straight to the office and called Julian. Julian drove down to the hangar within the hour. He didn't look worried. He looked annoyed. "Elias, we don't have time for a science project," Julian said, checking his watch. "Those are aftermarket equivalents. They meet the tensile strength requirements. Elias held one of the bolts in his hand. They don't have a certification stamp. Julian. They're untraceable. They're fine. I bought them myself to save overhead on the maintenance budget. Elias stared at him. Julian had been pocketing the difference between aerospace-grade titanium and cheap knockoffs. If these shear under load, the aircraft drops like a stone, Elias said. Nothing is going to shear, Julian snapped. Put the hub back together. Sign the release, and I'll authorize your payment right now, including a $5,000 bonus for finishing early. $5,000. Plus the contract money. It was everything Elias needed. It would save his shop. It would secure his life with Lily. All he had to do was put his name on a piece of paper and look the other way. Julian pulled a pen from his inside pocket and held it out. Sign it. Elias, don't be an idiot. You need this money. Elias looked at the pen. He thought about the bank notice on his desk. He thought about Lily, drawing circles with a wrench. Then he thought about the pilot and the passengers, who would be trusting their lives to his signature tomorrow morning. This is the moment that defines who you are. If you were in Elias's shoes, what would you do? Take a second right now and type in the comments. I choose integrity, no matter the cost. Let people know where you stand. Elias didn't take the pen. I'm not signing it, Elias said. Julian's face turned red. Then you're not getting paid. Not a dime, and I'll have the bank repo this hangar by tomorrow afternoon. Julian grabbed the paperwork. I'll get a contractor in here tonight who actually wants to work. Don't touch my aircraft again. Julian stormed out of the hangar. Elias stood alone in the quiet shop. He was officially broke. But he knew Julian was going to bring in a dirty inspector to forge the sign-off. They were going to fly that helicopter anyway. Elias wasn't going to let that happen. He walked over to his toolbox, grabbed a specialized hex driver, and climbed back up to the engine cowling. He opened the main avionics bay. He reached deep inside and disconnected the primary ignition control module. It was a piece of hardware the size of a deck of cards, completely essential to starting the engines. Elias slipped it into his pocket. Then he grabbed a bright red warning tag. Wrote, "Do not fly," due to fatal hardware failure in thick black marker, and zip-tied it directly to the pilot's control stick. He locked up the shop, drove home, and made dinner for his daughter. He didn't sleep at all that night, because tomorrow morning, all hell was going to break loose on the tarmac. By 7 the next morning, the airfield was already hot. Elias stood in the shadow of his hangar, holding a cup of black coffee. He watched Julian's black SUV pull onto the tarmac. Julian wasn't alone. He brought a guy named Vance, a freelance aviation inspector with a reputation for signing anything, if the price was right. Julian didn't even look at Elias. He marched Vance straight into the hangar. 10 minutes later, Vance walked out, wiping his hands. He handed Julian a freshly stamped airworthiness certificate. He hadn't checked a single torque value. He hadn't run a single diagnostic test. He had just signed away the lives of everyone who was about to board that aircraft, for a few $100 in a paper envelope. When you see someone trade human lives for a quick payout, it makes your blood boil. If you are still with me, drop that comment right now. I choose integrity, no matter the cost. Let's drown out the people who think money buys everything. At exactly 8 o'clock, a convoy of Blacktown cars pulled up to the hangar. The chairman of AeroCorp stepped out, flanked by his executive team. Right behind them was Captain Miller. Miller was in his late 50s. He was a former Marine aviator who had flown in combat zones and survived by never trusting an aircraft until he verified it himself. Julian greeted the chairman with a bright, plastic smile. He handed the freshly signed certificate directly to Captain Miller. Miller barely glanced at the paper. He folded it, walked past Julian, and climbed into the cockpit to start his pre-flight checks. Julian stood on the tarmac, looking incredibly smug. He shot a glare over at Elias, who was still standing quietly by the chain-link fence. Julian's message was clear. You lost, and now you are going to lose everything else. But inside the cockpit, Captain Miller flipped the primary battery switch. Nothing happened. The digital displays stayed completely dark. Miller frowned. He reached down and found the bright red warning tag, zip-tied directly to the cyclic control stick. Do not fly due to fatal hardware failure. Miller climbed out of the helicopter, holding the red tag in his fist. His face was like carved stone. "Who red-tagged my aircraft?" Miller asked, his voice cutting through the noise of the airfield. Julian's smile vanished instantly. He rushed forward, waving his hands in a panic. "It is a mistake, Captain. We had a disgruntled local mechanic try to sabotage the schedule because he is broke. Vance just cleared the aircraft 10 minutes ago." Miller looked at Vance, who suddenly looked very pale. Then, Miller looked at the red tag again. He turned the tag over and read the signature written on the back in thick black ink. Elias Thorne. Miller went completely still. He looked up and scanned the perimeter of the airfield until he spotted Elias leaning against the fence. Miller walked right past Julian. He walked right past the billionaire chairman. He marched straight over to Elias. "Thorne," Miller said, "did you pull my ignition module?" "Yes, sir," Elias said calmly. "Care to tell me why?" "Your main rotor hub is held together by counterfeit retaining bolts. No serial numbers, no stress test stamps, and no chain of custody. If you pull maximum pitch on takeoff, that rotor is separating from the mast." Julian ran up behind them, breathless and sweating through his expensive suit. "He is lying. He is just trying to extort us because his shop is going bankrupt." Vance signed off on those parts. Captain Miller didn't even look at Julian. He just kept his eyes locked on Elias. They had never worked together directly, but in the aviation world, reputations are everything. Miller knew exactly who Elias Thorne was. He knew Thorne was the guy you called when a mechanical problem was impossible to solve. More importantly, he knew Thorne was a man who never lied about metal. Miller slowly turned his head and looked back at Julian. "If Thorne says the hub is compromised, the hub is compromised. I am not flying this death trap." Miller tossed the helicopter keys directly into Julian's chest. The keys clattered onto the hard concrete. Have you ever witnessed a moment where true expertise completely shattered fake authority? If you love seeing arrogance get exactly what it deserves, hit the like button right now. The chairman of AeroCorp, who had been watching the entire exchange in absolute silence, finally stepped forward. He didn't yell. He didn't panic. He just looked at his operations director and asked one simple question. "Where did you buy those bolts?" Julian started stammering. He started talking fast about supply chain issues, approved vendor lists, and budget cuts. But it was completely over. By noon, a federal aviation audit team was crawling all over the helicopter. They didn't just find the fake bolts. They pulled the procurement records from Julian's office laptop. They found a paper trail showing Julian had been buying counterfeit aerospace parts for 3 years. He had been funneling the extra money into a fake shell company, registered in his wife's name. Julian was escorted off the airfield in handcuffs before 3 o'clock. He wasn't just fired. He was facing federal wire fraud and severe reckless endangerment charges. As for the dirty inspector, Vance, the feds pulled his licensing credentials on the spot. The chairman walked over to Elias's shop later that afternoon. He didn't send a corporate representative. He came himself, walking past the oil drums and the toolboxes. He looked Elias in the eye and apologized for what had happened on his watch. Then, he pulled out a company checkbook. He didn't just pay the original contract amount. He paid triple. Then, he handed Elias a thick manila folder containing a permanent retainer agreement. Elias was officially hired as the independent safety auditor for AeroCorp's entire regional fleet. Moving forward, nobody could touch a corporate rotorcraft without Elias Thorne's signature. Elias took the check, locked up the shop, and drove home. When he walked into his kitchen, the final bank notice was still sitting under his coffee mug. He picked it up, tore it right down the middle, and threw it in the trash. That evening, Lily was sitting on the living room floor. She was drawing another picture with her crayons. She looked up at him as he sat down on the sofa. "Did you fix the big helicopter, Dad?" she asked. Elias sat down next to her on the rug and looked at her drawing. "Yeah, Peanut," he said softly. "I fixed it." "How?" "By making sure it stayed exactly where it was." Lily smiled, accepting that as a perfectly reasonable answer. We spend a lot of time worrying about the things we might lose if we stand our ground. We worry about our jobs, our money, and our status. But Elias knew the cold, hard truth. You can always find another way to make a living. But once you sell your signature, once you sell your integrity, you can never buy it back. If this story meant something to you, leave one final comment down below. Tell the world, I stand my ground. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that doing the right thing is always worth it, even when it hurts. We will see you in the next story.